Hell will not defy me!
The siren screamed as if it could rip winter itself in half. And in Auschwitz, in the year 1943, the snow was no longer white. It was grey with ash, while smoke from tall chimneys slid across the sky like a funeral cloth that never dried. Franceska walked down a narrow corridor where the concrete seemed to pull at her feet, but her eyes stayed bright. Not with naive hope, with the hard light of someone driven to the edge who refuses to let her soul be crushed into silence. Ahead, a steel door hung half open, breathing damp air that carried bleach, rust, and the fear of too many bodies forced into too little space. And in the doorway, Officer Schillinger blocked the passage like a living shadow, his black boots striking the floor as if rehearsing a ritual. He looked Franceska up and down the way a man inspects an object, then lifted his chin and said, cold and smooth like a blade that has cut dignity too many times, "Take it all off. Dance for me before you die." Behind Franceska, other women trembled, swallowing their sobs as if even sound could be punished, gripping sleeves the way drowning hands grip air, staring at the floor as if not looking up might make what comes next lighter. But Franceska did not cry and did not beg. She only breathed slowly and listened to her heartbeat drum inside a thin ribcage, a stubborn rhythm in a place where lives were reduced to tallies. She was 22, once a known ballet dancer, once lifted by music under stage lights, once certain that a life could be measured in graceful landings. Applause. And a crumpled letter kept warm in her palm, a letter never mailed when the war arrived like a storm and began calling names for trains. Now there was no stage, only weak bulbs swaying overhead and rifles clicking like a filthy metronome. Yet Franceska stood straight, as if bending her back would hand the world another victory. Schillinger folded his arms. The guards behind him smirked with laughter as dry as snapping wood, and Franceska raised her gaze to meet his. Not pleading, not yielding, a flame pressed to its last oxygen. She began to dance, without music, with only breath, metal, and wind whining through the door seam. And for one suspended moment, her ballet made the room tilt out of time, forcing the camp to witness what it was built to destroy, a human being still choosing how to stand. Far away, on other continents, radios promised freedom and posters sold duty in bright ink. But here the war spoke in boots and keys. And Franceska was about to answer in the only language Schillinger did not expect. Franceska let the first movement unfold the way she once let music lead her. Not for them, never for them, but to seize the room by its own breath. Her arms opened in a clean arc, her wrists turning as if drawing a thin line through dirty air, and the corridor noise seemed to fade until all that remained was the soft scrape of her foot on concrete and the faint clink of a leather strap on a metal buckle. Schillinger watched like a man convinced the world exists only to obey him. And the guards behind him leaned in with that dull hunger that comes from boredom and power. Yet what held them was not desire. It was the contradiction. A woman at the edge of death moving with calm precision, making their weapons and laughter feel suddenly clumsy. She began to remove what she had been forced to wear, slowly and without display, letting fabric fall as if each piece were a door closing on their control. And she kept her face composed, refusing to give them tears they could collect like trophies. In places like this, the lies were practical, a steel door labelled like a routine, a room arranged like a changing area, hooks and pegs that suggested order, sometimes even the remembered rumour of showers. as if murder could be disguised as hygiene for one more minute. And Franceska understood that this was also a stage. Only the script had been written by men who believed fear would do all the acting. Schillinger stepped closer, the smell of tobacco and polished leather mixing with the cold bite of metal, and he said, almost amused, "Faster." Franceska did not answer. She turned. She pivoted. She let a controlled spin place her a fraction farther from his reach, and the women behind her saw it, a tiny shift that said she was not only enduring, she was choosing. A memory flashed through her like a match struck in a wind tunnel, a wooden floor beneath her shoes, a spotlight warm on her cheek, a folded letter in her palm with a few lines of tenderness that never made it to the mailbox once the war began, naming people like Cargo. And the warmth of that memory did not soften her. It hardened her, because it reminded her she had once been treated as human. Schillinger leaned in, trying to reclaim the moment with proximity. And in a voice meant to stain the air, he asked, "Who do you think you are?" Franceska kept dancing, but her eyes moved with purpose, measuring the distance from his stance to his belt, listening to the faint rub of the pistol holster against the buckle, watching the angle of his shoulders, waiting for a beat as exact as a landing. He reached as if to touch, as if touch could turn her into property, and Franceska slid half a step away, still within the dance, still calm. And that small refusal made him grin, because he mistook control for fear, never realizing she was counting time, and that the next movement would not be part of his script. The room beyond the half-open steel door was lit by bulbs that trembled on their wires, and the air felt thick, as if every breath had to push past the breath of those who came before. Hooks lined one wall like silent instructions, and a plain sign meant to suggest routine hung at a crooked angle, the kind of staging that turned murder into a procedure, somewhere outside. A loudspeaker barked, clipped German commands. Flat as a radio bulletin with no music, Schillinger pointed toward the door as if pointing to a timetable and growled, "Enough. Take the rest off. Then go inside." Franceska answered with motion, not words, turning her body so the guards had to follow her rhythm instead of their own. She let fabric slip away with the same restraint she used on a stage, refusing to give them anything but control and time. Behind her, the women pressed together, eyes wide, and Franceska caught one glance that felt like a hand on her shoulder, a silent question, and she gave back a silent promise with the steadiness of her spine. Schillinger moved closer, trying to crowd her with his presence, and hissed, "Who do you think you are?" Franceska kept her face calm, but inside she replayed a training of another kind. The discipline of landing, the certainty of balance. She watched the pistol at his belt sway when he shifted weight, listened to the faint scrape of leather, and waited for a beat clean enough to cut. She lowered as if in submission, bending to her high-heeled shoe, and for an instant the room held its breath, guards leaning in, prisoners shrinking back, the whole space suspended on the small sound of a buckle. Her fingers closed around the heel, cold as iron, and the memory of a letter crumpled in her palm flashed like a warm lamp in blackout, a line of affection that the war had tried to erase. And that warmth became a blade. Schillinger tilted his head to see better, smug and careless, and Franceska rose in one sharp motion, the heel snapping upward in a short, precise arc. Bop! The impact cracking through the hush. Schillinger staggered, hand flying to his face, pain and humiliation twisting his features. And in that split second Franceska stepped in, her hand hooking his belt, her fingers finding the holster latch as if it were a familiar clasp, and she yanked the pistol free, heavy and real in her grip, while the guards' smiles died into shock and the women behind her inhaled like they had just found air. Franceska leveled the weapon at Schillinger's chest. Voice low and steady. "Look at me." For a heartbeat, the pistol did not look like power. It looked like weight. Like cold truth in a hand that had spent years learning control. And when Franceska said, "Look at me," it was not a threat meant to impress men. It was a command meant to pin the moment in place so it could not be stolen back by their routine. Schillinger's hand was still pressed to his face. His eyes wide with the shock of being touched by consequence. And he tried to speak, to spit out an order, to summon the world he owned by voice alone. But his mouth shaped nothing that could stop what had already begun. Franceska squeezed the trigger, and the sound snapped through the room like a whip crack against stone. Then another, so close it felt like a single brutal syllable. And Schillinger folded as if the camp itself had suddenly lost balance. The guards froze. Not because they cared about him, but because the script had broken. The one script that kept this place moving. Undress. Line up. Obey. Disappear. In any other wartime documentary, you might hear a narrator calmly explain how the machinery of Auschwitz-Birkenau depended on speed and deception, on turning murder into procedure so the perpetrators could pretend it was work. But here the camera would shake, because procedure has no answer when the victim acts first. One guard shouted, "Shoot her." Another reached for his rifle. But in that split second of stunned delay, the women behind Franceska surged forward as if a chain had snapped. Hands grabbing sleeves, belts, wrists, anything they could seize. Not organized. Not heroic in the polished way propaganda loved. Just raw survival, suddenly remembering it still had muscles. A body slammed into a guard's shoulder. A cap flew. A strap tore. And the room erupted into a storm of breath. Cries. Boots. And metal. Franceska stepped back to keep her footing. The pistol shaking now from recoil and adrenaline. Smoke stinging her eyes. And she scanned the faces in front of her the way she once scanned a stage for her mark, searching not for victory but for a gap, a doorway, a second that could be turned into movement. She could not open the camp. She knew that. She could not unbuild the fences. But she could widen a crack in time, long enough for someone else to slip through. Schillinger tried to rise, rage and fear mixing in his expression, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. And Franceska saw it. The naked panic behind the uniform. The truth that the man who had demanded humiliation could be humiliated too, could be reduced too, could be forced to understand, if only for an instant, what it meant to be powerless. A guard lunged toward her, rifle swinging up, and Franceska shouted over the chaos. Not a speech. Just a single urgent word meant for the women whose eyes were burning with terror and sudden hope. Run. And for the first time the room felt less like a waiting line and more like a rupture. A brief rebellion in the heart of a machine built to erase rebellion from the world. The rupture lasted only as long as a breath in freezing air. Because Auschwitz was designed to swallow disorder the way the sky swallowed smoke. And after the first stunned second, the system snapped back with practiced violence. Boots pounding in from the corridor. Shouted German orders cutting through the screams. Rifles lifting as if pulled by strings. The women who had surged forward were shoved and separated. Some dragged back by their arms. Some stumbling into the walls. And the steel door slammed and rattled as though the building itself were trying to clamp down on what had just happened. Franceska still gripped the pistol. Her fingers cramped around metal that had been hers for a moment and would never be hers again. And the air smelled of burnt powder and bleach and sweat. A bitter mixture that made her throat feel raw. She tried to steady her stance the way she would steady before a difficult landing. But the floor was not a stage, and the light was not kind, and the noise was not music. It was chaos turning into punishment. A blow knocked her sideways, not described in gore, only in sensation. A hard shock that made the room tilt, her ears ringing as if she had been plunged under water, her knees hitting the cold concrete with a sound she felt in her bones. The pistol nearly slipped from her hand, and she clamped down harder, as if the weapon were not just a tool but evidence that the camp's ritual could be interrupted, that the lie could be pierced, that a number could still be a person. Somewhere nearby, a woman cried out a name. Not a camp number, a real name. And that alone sounded like defiance. Another voice pleaded for a sister, for a mother, and those words, fragile and ordinary, were suddenly louder in Franceska's mind than the commands being barked in German. She lifted her head and saw the bulbs swaying overhead like small, exhausted stars. And in the space between shouts she heard something else. A ghost of music from before the war. A wooden floor beneath her shoes. A backstage whisper that had once made her smile. And she realized that love did not need to be present to be real. It could live in a crumpled letter never mailed, in a remembered touch, in the simple refusal to die as an object. The guards closed in, and the line of rifles leveled toward her looked like the final punctuation of their power. Yet Franceska's face stayed composed. Not fearless, but resolved, because she understood that she had traded her own time for someone else's seconds. And seconds were everything in a place built to deny even that. Another force struck her, her vision flashing white at the edges, and she felt her body grow strangely light, not in triumph, but in that thin, unreal way a dancer feels just before leaving the ground, as if her whole life of discipline had been training for one last movement that belonged only to her. Her hand still held the pistol, and even as her strength slipped, she kept it, because letting it fall would feel like letting the moment be rewritten, and she would not give them that comfort. The last sounds Franceska registered were not speeches or slogans, only the raw noise of a place built to erase noise. Boots rushing, metal clattering, a steel door slamming like a jaw, and voices calling out names as if names could pull people back from the edge. Her breath left her in a thin cloud that vanished instantly in the cold air. But she did not vanish with it, because in her final moment she was not a number being processed. She was a woman choosing the shape of her ending. Later, outside the camp, history would move the way it always moves after catastrophe, in fragments and testimonies, in the gaps between what is documented and what is remembered, and Franceska's act would travel through that space as both fact and legend, repeated because it carried something the machinery of Auschwitz could not tolerate, the idea that the victim might seize agency even in the last room. Responsible telling has to admit what scholars and memorial institutions often explain, that details can shift in retellings, that the precise choreography of seconds is hard to fix when witnesses are terrified and perpetrators record nothing that shames them. Yet the core image persists across accounts. An officer named Schillinger. A moment of humiliation turned into resistance. Shots fired. Chaos erupting. And then the swift crushing of that rebellion. In the language of documentary film, you would cut from the corridor to the wider map. Fences and watchtowers. Rails that carried people in. The scale of Auschwitz-Birkenau as a complex of forced labor and mass murder. And then back again. Because scale explains the crime, but it is a single face that makes the viewer feel it. You would also cut, briefly, to the world beyond the wire, to wartime radios and posters that promised noble sacrifice and clean purpose. Reminders that propaganda can make war look like a story with heroes and certainty, while Franceska's story exposes war's most intimate cruelty. the attempt to strip a person of dignity before stripping them of life. Her death was not an escape, and the camp did not fall because of her. But something still shifted, because everyone who saw it learned, for one instant, that the uniform was not invincible, that the boot could slip, that fear could change direction, and even if the system restored itself in minutes, the memory could not be fully erased. Auschwitz remained, cold and efficient, snow still falling, smoke still crawling across the sky. Yet somewhere in the collective mind, a sharp sound remained, the crack of a heel against the face of power. Like a final footstep on a stage no one wanted to exist, and if love had been the unseen ember in Franceska's palm, then courage was the flame it lit, leaving a last note that was not happy, not comforting, but enduring, because it insists, even now, that darkness does not get to decide how every story ends.